So, Chapter 408 of Hunter x Hunter just dropped, and while not a crazy amount happened, the chapter revolved in its entirety around Borkson and Morena playing a card game to see if Borkson is going to join Morena's team of the Haley murderers. But the chapter lacked an action it made up for in exposition. See, because in this chapter that essentially boiled down to the most high-stakes game of Uno you've ever seen, we got a pretty insane info dump on specialists in the Hunter x Hunter universe. See, because it was revealed in this chapter that the reason that Borkson was being actively recruited by Morena in the first place is because Borkson is a specialist. And while that in itself isn't all that interesting because genuinely, who cares about Borkson, it was also revealed by Morena the amount of people that are born specialists in the Hunter x Hunter world, which is just about 1 in 3,000 people. And while it does sound pretty common, that does mean that only 1 in 3,000 Nen users are specialists. And considering the fact that Nen users are exceedingly rare, this means that the number of specialists was always gonna be minimal at most. And because of this massive piece of exposition about specialist birth rate and the reveal of Borkson being a specialist who may or may not be awoken to Nen in the next couple of chapters, I got to thinking about all of the specialists that we've seen up until this point in Hunter x Hunter. And as I sat there and thought about all of the specialists that we've met over the course of Hunter x Hunter in these 400 plus chapters, I realized that specialists aren't as rare as Morena is saying that they are. In fact, with the reveal of Borkson as a specialist, that means we now have 12 confirmed Nen specialists in the Hunter x Hunter universe. And for a show that's probably introduced to us less than 200 Nen users over the course of those 400 plus chapters, that's not exactly a 1 in 3,000 hit rate. But regardless of all of that, today I want to talk about those 12 specialists. Go over them one by one, break down what their abilities are, how they use them, and maybe more importantly than anything, how powerful they were. Because today, mostly gentlemen, we're talking all specialists in Hunter x Hunter, ranked and explained. Before we get to explaining anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Now I know, some of you are saying, Nick, there's 12 specialists in Hunter x Hunter, where? I thought specialists were supposed to be exceedingly rare, and honestly, I can't necessarily blame you for not remembering all 12 of these specialists. Not only did specialists kind of become a commonplace occurrence during the Chimera Ant arc and after, but also a lot of the specialists on this list are kind of forgettable. None more so than our last place entry on this list, coming in at number 12, Borkson. Ironically, even though Borkson is the reason this video is being made in the first place, I hesitate to even add her onto this list, on account of the fact that even though Borkson has been identified as a specialist, Borkson doesn't even have Nen yet. Tie that into the fact that Borkson wasn't introduced to the story until the Black Whale arc, and that Borkson is just a private first class in the Cockeen Empire Royal Army, and you have a character who is painfully uninteresting. However, considering the fact that the Hunter x Hunter manga has literally stopped dead in its tracks and revolved around her for 2 straight chapters, makes me believe that in the future of this manga, she will be anything but incredibly uninteresting. However, unfortunately, as of right now, with the release of Chapter 408 being the most recent chapter of Hunter x Hunter, the only thing that I can use to power scale Borkson's powers at all is the fact that she is incredibly intelligent, a master strategic mind who's actively trying to find a way out of Morena's death card game right now. Now, when Borkson does eventually awaken to Nen in the next couple of chapters, we'll probably do a video breaking down what her new ability is, and this rating will become a moot point, but for the moment, Borkson is our weakest ever specialist. Which brings us to our number 11 spot, which honestly isn't that much higher than Borkson. Because coming in at number 11, we have Hina. Now Hina, outside of just being an excuse for Togashi to finally draw his inflation kink, while not powerful, was incredibly useful. See, Hina is a Chimera Ant, and she was, before the destruction of the Chimera Ants as a faction, a squad captain in Lael's squad. Now simply just based off the fact that she was a squad captain seems to imply that Hina held on to a fair amount of power. Squad captains, after all, based off everything that we saw in the Chimera Ant arc, seem to scale somewhere in the region of lower range members of the Phantom Troop. Characters like Shalnark, who existed in the lower spectrum of the strengthometer in the Phantom Troop, struggled in combat against squad captains and squad leaders. However, obviously that was in combat against Chimera Ants who had offensive focused abilities. And basically the only thing that we've ever seen from Hina in terms of offensive based abilities was 1, when she lifted a gigantic rock up a Bezef to save his life, and 2, when Lael said out of all of the fighters in his squad, Hina was the second most powerful, only behind himself. This is slightly backed up by the fact that Hina was able to tank a punch from Ramot after being awakened to Nen, all without any visible damage, implying that she has a certain level of durability. But really when it comes down to it, Hina's usefulness is derived from her ability as a Nen exorcist. See, Hina has the ability to remove Nen-imposed curses, and when she removes these Nen-imposed curses, they go down into her belly, causing her to inflate and to look pregnant, and also to excite all of the sickos reading Hunter x Hunter. And the larger and more powerful the curse, the larger Hina inflates. And Hina's belly doesn't deflate until either the curse is lifted or the person that the curse is placed on dies. But regardless, this does make Hina one of 2 Nen exorcists on Earth who has the ability to exorcise curses of really any level. And that's a power that can't be understated. And so is being able to see the future, which is the ability of our number 10 spot, Neon Nostrad. Neon Nostrad is the daughter of Light Nostrad, the former head of the Nostrad family before Kurapika took it over. And she, kind of like Hina, is never involved in direct combat, and therefore power scaling her ability doesn't necessarily make the most sense. But now that we're talking about it, why did I put a Chimera Ant below Neon Nostrad? Flip Neon and Hina. What am I doing with my life? I'm still jet lagged. Leave me alone, please. Anyways, coming in at number 11 is Neon Nostrad, who's involved in even less combat than Hina. Though objectively, if we were ranking based off the usefulness of the specialist abilities that we're talking about today, Neon would exist above Hina. Yes, a Nen exorcist is a fantastic person to know. However, somebody who can tell you your future in the form of a poem, probably a bit better to know. Because if you ever get cursed with Nen, yes, absolutely, Hina's the best person you could go to. Not a lot of people are getting cursed with Nen, but everybody does have a future. Well, except for Neon Nostrad. But regardless, Neon's specialist ability, Lovely Ghostwriter, allows her to predict the future through the medium of quatrains. Now, a quatrain, for those of you who don't know, is a poem that contains 4 stanzas, which is essentially poem talk for 4 paragraphs, or 4 sentences. Now, Lovely Ghostwriter is actually less of a Nen ability and more of the summoning of a Nen beast, because the Lovely Ghostwriter itself is a Nen beast that Neon is contracted to in a sense. But because of this, when Neon activates her specialist ability, technically it's not her doing the writing. See, so long as somebody hands Neon a piece of paper that contains their full name, their date of birth, and their blood type, Neon is able to activate her Lovely Ghostwriter technique and write down the future of said person. Neon then writes 4 paragraphs with 4 lines each, with each line representing a week of the month that the 4 paragraphs represent, which tell the future on a week-by-week, month-by-month basis of the person whose future she's writing. However, Neon, because she's being controlled by the Lovely Ghostwriter, doesn't remember the fortunes that she writes. She also doesn't have the ability to predict her own future, and therefore, unfortunately, she's kind of just a tool to be used by more powerful people, like her father. And so when it comes down to it, from a specialist perspective, she's probably the weakest out of all of the specialists whose Nen abilities we know, though her ability in itself is massively useful to the point where Krollo decides to steal it from her. But enough about all of these non-combatants, let's talk about specialists who have actually been in fights. Because coming in at number 9, we have our first real entry with Melioron. Now, Melioron is a squadron leader Chimera Ant, which immediately to most people should be setting off alarm bells in your head that say he should be higher on this list, and technically you would be right. However, Melioron has identified himself to be the weakest out of all of the squadron leaders, saying himself that in terms of fighting ability, he's probably only as strong as your standard foot soldier Chimera Ant, which still makes him more powerful than all regular humans. He himself admits the fact that if another squadron leader were to punch him, it would immediately kill him. Now, this claim doesn't end up being 100% accurate, as he, much like Hina, is also able to take a punch from Ramot and survive, proving that his durability is probably higher than he gives himself credit for. But when it comes down to it, out of all of the squadron leaders of the Chimera Ants, he's probably the weakest, though he's also probably one of the more intelligent. See, because Melioron identified the fact that people were going to look down on him because of his lack of physical strength, and therefore he convinced all of the Chimera Ants that he didn't trust that the only ability he had was his invisibility, not letting any of them know about his true specialist Nen ability, the Perfect Plan, which, while holding his breath, allows for him to use an even higher form of invisibility, making him completely undetectable from sight, smell, sound, hearing, anything, really. Even those searching with Nen are unable to detect him when he's using Perfect Plan. In fact, the level at which he's able to mask his presence is so complete that that's a genuine fear, because nobody would be able to perceive him in any sense if an attack were to go awry or stray and hit him while he was using Perfect Plan and kill him, that if you were to die while using Perfect Plan, nobody would ever be able to find his body, mostly because post-mortem Nen would make sure that Perfect Plan would continue to be used. Now, the only reason that this was ever really an issue is because there's an extension of the Perfect Plan specialist ability, and that is God's Accomplice, which allows for Melioran to extend Perfect Plan to somebody he's in contact with. And therefore, if he were to die while using God's Accomplice, the person he was in contact with prior to his death would be erased from existence forever. And therefore, the risk associated with God's Accomplice is kind of high. But still, the ability to erase your presence to the point where even people using N aren't able to detect you is an insanely broken ability, especially when you consider the fact that he could use it on people like Gon, who could charge his Jaja Ken directly behind an opponent without them noticing that Gon was there. And for that, Melioran gets the 9 spot. But because a lot of his fighting ability revolves around using other people's offensive capabilities, I can't put him higher than our number 8 spot on this list, Pakunoda. Now, stop me if you heard this before, but Pakunoda is by far and away not the most powerful person in her group. Pakunoda ranked 11th in the arm wrestling competition amongst the Phantom Troop, implying that her physical strength is 11th in the troop, which is almost last, with the only person below her being Shizuku. However, being one of the physically weakest people in the Phantom Troop isn't necessarily a bad thing. That's a pretty high bar, as Shizuku was able to punch holes in Chimera ants who could use Nen. I mean, Pakunoda is, for all intents and purposes, massively stronger than your average human being, as she was able to break Squala's bones in his arms like they were chopsticks. In terms of speed, Pakunoda is definitely the fastest person that we've had on this list thus far, as she was fast enough to keep up with the other spiders when they were chasing after Squala, and she was able to move out of the way when Nobunaga attacked to kill Squala. But really, when it comes down to it, Pakunoda wasn't a physical fighter. She was a conjurer and a specialist who would fight using conjured Nen bullets, as well as Nen enhanced regular bullets. And when it comes down to it, she's probably the most proficient gun user in the entirety of Hunter x Hunter, as by far and away her most ever impressive feat is when she was able to use Memory Bomb on 6 Phantom Troop members before the chain around her heart exploded it. That is to say, she was able to hit 6 headshots almost immediately. What did this hip firing experiment get Pakunoda, and why was she shooting Phantom Troop members in the head? Well, that's because Pakunoda is a specialist, and her specialist ability is psychometry. See, Pakunoda had a very powerful and very rare ability that allowed her to read the memories of anybody she came into contact with. All Pakunoda had to do was come into contact with somebody and ask them specific questions, and then through an incredibly skillful process, Pakunoda could extract the purest memories from their brain, which allowed her to essentially extract any information that she would need about anybody the Phantom Troop needed interrogated. On top of this, Pakunoda's ability extends to objects, as Pakunoda has the ability to feel an object and look back into its past. And while the amount of time she can look back into the past is never specified, the fact that she can do it at all is very impressive. But we still haven't answered the question of why Pakunoda needed to shoot 6 of the Phantom Troop members in the head before her heart exploded. And the answer to that question lies in her second specialist ability, Memory Bomb. See, this ability allows for Pakunoda to shoot memories, including her own, into the skulls of other people using conjured Nen bullets. This was not a combat ability and inflicted absolutely no damage. On top of that, if Pakunoda had already read somebody's memories, she could load that into a memory bomb, shoot them back into the person's head, and that would erase those memories from their head. And therefore, when it came down to extorting people or interrogating people, nobody was stronger than Pakunoda. And while she wasn't necessarily the most offensively capable member of the Phantom Troop, she was an indispensable part of it. And once again, even though I sound like I'm beating a dead horse-faced woman here, Pakunoda had a chain placed around her heart by Kurapika that said if she told the other Phantom Troop members about his abilities, that the chain would constrict and destroy her heart, and yet she still decided to do it, and in the moment that her heart was being destroyed, she still managed to hit 6 headshots. But enough about stealing memories, let's talk about stealing abilities. Because coming up at number 7 on our list, we got Chrollo. Listen, everyone's always saying, oh, Chrollo this, Chrollo that, he fought 2 Zoldix, he fought Hisoka.
He's one of the most powerful people in the universe. You can't place him at number 7, Nick.
But listen, on this list here, I have written at the 7th spot, the specialist whose ability allows them to steal other people's techniques. Wait 1 second, I'm getting a call here. Yeah. What do you mean there's 2 of them? The lion Chimera Ant has the same ability as Chrollo, but he only can use the techniques for an hour? But I already did like a whole thing talking about how Chrollo wasn't strong enough. I mean, we can probably delete it, right? Yeah, no, Cody's not vindictive or anything like that. Okay, cool. Yeah, we'll backpedal. It's fine. Anyways, coming in at number 7, we have Lael. And yeah, he's got basically Krollo's Skill Hunter, but we're not talking about his net ability quite yet. Lael was the squadron leader of the Chimera Ants and the squadron leader of Hina. Therefore, as a squadron leader, he was one of the most powerful Chimera Ants in existence, a claim that he absolutely backed up. I mean, this is a character that was able to throw a harpoon at sonic speed and punch it through a whale in the deep sea from the shore. And while Lael does eventually lose in combat against Moral, Moral is widely considered to be one of the strongest hunters in existence. And therefore being able to push Moral to the point where he had to figure out how to poison Lael with CO2 to win is an impressive feat in itself alone. But how is Lael able to push Moral to this brink in the first place? Well, outside the fact that he was born as a squadron leader Chimera Ant with insane physical strength and accuracy, Lael was a specialist like all the other people on this list. But his specialist ability was kind of crazy. See, Lael's specialist ability was known as Rental Pod, a technique that allowed him to temporarily borrow the Nen techniques of other people, so long as he managed to fulfill 2 conditions, and 2 pretty easy conditions, mind you. The first condition is that he needs to know the name of the ability or have seen it used in the past. The second condition is that he needs to do the owner of the Nen technique a favor and confirm the acceptance of a debt in the form of a question like, "You owe me," right? And the favor can be legitimately anything. Hey, need me to pick up that lighter you dropped? Okay, here you go. You owe me now, right? And then cool, I have Skill Hunter for an hour. And the crazy thing is, this scales for every favor done for the Nen owner. So if I saw Skill Hunter be used and then I did 12 favors for Krollo, guess what? I get to use Skill Hunter 12 times. And to access this ability, all I need to do is open up my pod rental Nen iPod, scroll down to the borrowed Nen ability, print out a receipt that has that ability, tear up the receipt, and then boom, I get that ability for an hour. And during that hour, that Nen ability cannot be used by the person I'm borrowing it from. So it makes this technique ridiculously broken in 1v1 scenarios, assuming that you've been able to borrow the Nen technique of the person you're fighting. Now, if the person whose Nen ability you're using dies, you lose all the information, kind of like with Skill Hunter, and thus are technically an incentive to keep the people whose Nen abilities you have borrowed alive. And with the pod rental, we saw Lael use a ton of different abilities. Not as many as Krollo, but he's not in the story as long as Krollo. He had abilities like Saddle a Tombo, a technique that he borrowed from Flutter that allowed him to generate butterflies that he could use to scout areas. An ability called Inamura that he borrowed from Grotchan, which gave him access to abilities like Tornave and Big Wall, which allowed him to manipulate water at probably the highest level we see elemental control in all of Hunter x Hunter, being able to create gigantic vortexes of water or tsunamis 100 feet high. And while Lael ends up dying in the first real battle we ever saw from him, that doesn't mean that this slightly worse Skill Hunter in terms of the ability to use other people's techniques, but slightly better Skill Hunter in terms of being able to steal other people's techniques easier, wasn't one of the most impressive Nen techniques we saw in all of Hunter x Hunter. But what's more impressive, being able to steal people's techniques or being able to give people techniques? I'd reckon in the world of Hunter x Hunter, being able to give people techniques is actually more impressive, and that's because we've only ever seen one person with that ability, and that one person is our number 6 spot, Morena. Or not Morena, based off the events of chapter 408. See, technically, I will admit, putting Morena this high on the list is kind of a stretch, because we haven't seen Morena involved in anything remotely close to combat. However, based off the strength alone of her Nen technique, which we now, after the events of chapter 408, understand better, I reckon that she deserves to be this high on the list, but I could understand if you wanted her lower. See, because it's tough to scale a person whose Nen technique revolves around making other people loyal to her and then giving them Nen techniques, but considering the level of loyalty of all of the Haley family, and especially those who've already acquired Nen techniques, I'd reckon that those she's been able to bring into her fold and give techniques to should be considered as part of her power. Much in the same way that when we scale the power of Sun Jin Woo, we talk about his necromancy army. But before we get to explaining the powers of characters from outside of this universe, let's go a little bit deeper onto how Morena's specialist ability works. See, Morena's specialist ability is known as Contagion, a technique that she's been honing for 20 years. And when it comes down to it, this ability is one of the most terrifying we've seen in Hunter x Hunter, but mostly because of who it belongs to. See, Morena has the ability as the member 0 of her Nen technique to infect up to 22 people with her technique, by swapping saliva with them. And then every single person infected with contagion essentially becomes an MMORPG player. That is to say that every infected person gains a level every time they kill somebody. And every time they kill somebody, their aura increases. And after they kill 20 people and become a level 20, they manifest their own specific Nen technique that are highly specific to who they are as people. These Nen techniques range from the ability to transfer damage from other people onto themselves, the ability to manifest police robots, or create portals that allow you to travel from certain areas that are connected. And the craziest thing about all of this is that Morena actually controls the leveling system. It was Morena that decreed that the death of a non-Nen user was worth 1 level, the death of a Nen user was worth 10 levels, and the death of a prince was worth 50 levels. Now, Morena herself is a level 45, which means that she's increased her own aura output 45 times. On top of this, it's implied by Morena herself that she's able to keep up with the locations of everybody infected with contagion. As she says, she wants to infect one of Tessierdnich's soldiers so she can keep an eye on where he is at all times. And lastly, but most definitely not leastly, if somebody hits level 100, they themselves become an additional member 0, which means that they can go out and infect another 22 people, meaning that contagion is exactly what it's named after, a contagion that can scale exponentially assuming there's enough people to kill. So while yes, we haven't necessarily seen how hard Morena can punch you, we have seen how hard her underlings can punch you. And considering the fact that all of them would most likely die from Morena, I'd like to add their strength to hers. I mean, after all, Nobunaga, one of the stronger members of the Phantom Troop, hypothesized that A, contagion wasn't Morena's only Nen ability, and B, that the hideout that the Hylie currently lives in was partially created through one of her additional Nen abilities and is therefore invincible when she's in it. Attesting to the fact that the members of the Hylie family were able to repel the attacks of Nobunaga and Henry simultaneously while bouncing them from their hideout means that they're not to be trifled with, as the combined forces of an underboss of a Kakin Empire gang and one of the members of the Phantom Troop would probably be more strength than most people would be able to overcome. But probably one of the people who could overcome those odds is our number 5 pick, because coming up at number 5, we have a name we just brought up in Tessierdnich. Now, once again, I'll admit it, we haven't seen much in terms of offensive output from Tessierdnich, because like I said in the beginning of this video, most of the specialists on this list were introduced in either the Chimera Ant arc or after. But as it currently stands, Tessierdnich is the main antagonist of the Succession Contest arc. The big bad boogeyman, whose powers and capability to achieve more power is so astounding that basically everybody's quaking in their boots. He is the 4th prince of the Kakin Empire, and the upper bounds of his power are yet to be calculated, but are probably going to be rather serious. The outside of the fact that he's the 4th prince of the Kakin Empire and came from the first queen, which means he has an insane amount of political influence and is also a serial killer. He is also one of the most intelligent people in the entirety of the Hunter x Hunter universe, being actively compared to people like Krollo. And this is fair because Tessierdnich's capacity for growth basically knows no bounds. Tessierdnich went from awakening Nen to mastering Gyo in 1 day. Mind you, Gon, who was viewed as a once-in-a-lifetime genius when it came to figuring out Nen, took days, if not weeks, to master Gyo with Bisky and Killua during the Greed Island arc. He then immediately mastered Ten and Ren at such a speed that Theta, his Nen trainer, immediately had him doing advanced techniques that only masters who have spent years training in Nen would be able to do. On top of this, he was able to master Perfect Zetsu for an entire hour on only his 3rd attempt. And the mastering of that Perfect Zetsu was important, because Tessierdnich's specialization Nen technique revolves around the usage of Zetsu. Because when Tessierdnich closes his eyes and activates Zetsu, he receives a vision. And that vision, or precognition, or dream, or whatever he calls it, shows him the next 10 seconds of his life. However, that precognition doesn't take 10 seconds for him to watch. It's instantaneous. No time in the real world ellipses between the beginning of those 10 seconds in his head and the end. Now, after those ephemeral 10 seconds, if Tessierdnich keeps his eyes closed and his Zetsu activated, he will continue to see 10 seconds into the future. However, time will continue to flow around him, and therefore Tessierdnich will have a 10-second precognition, even though the world is moving around him. And I know what you're saying, his eyes are closed, how can he interact with the world? Well, in this state, he's not only able to interact with live time, but he's also able to continuously see 10 seconds into the future. And this state will continue until Tessierdnich opens his eyes, at which point he will relive the 10 seconds that he had seen prior to opening his eyes in the first place. Because remember, he was 10 seconds into the future in terms of cognition, but his body was 10 seconds behind. And while we haven't seen him use this ability too much, this ability did allow for him to dodge being shot in the head head by Theta. And the only conceivable weakness with this technique is that it requires Zetsu to activate, which means during the usage of this technique, Tessierdnich is weak against things like bullets, knives, and Nen-based abilities. But considering the fact that he's able to see 10 seconds into the future, he should be able to see where these attacks are coming from and dodge them anyways. And thus really the only answer to get rid of Tessierdnich is to overwhelm him with a sheer amount of attacks that he wouldn't be able to dodge in 10 seconds. But considering his level of genius, doing that could be difficult. And therefore, while I believe in a couple of months, assuming Hunter x Hunter doesn't go away anytime soon, Tessierdnich at 5 in terms of overall strength of all the specialists we've ever seen will probably end up being low, considering like a lot of the other specialists on this list we haven't seen all that much from him. Putting him any higher than this feels disingenuous, because I couldn't in my right mind put him above our number 4 spot on this list, Kurapika, the new MC of Hunter x Hunter. Now I could go over every single one of Kurapika's feats, and I'm going to. Because when it comes down to it, Kurapika has one of the most impressive resumes in the entirety of Hunter x Hunter. He packed up the physically strongest member of the Phantom Troop in Uvagin in a 1v1. He manipulated Pakunoda into giving herself over to him by taking Chrollo as a hostage, bound her heart with a chain that would eventually tear it to pieces, and, while it was only temporarily, stripped Chrollo of his Nen. Now, well, obviously, the fact that he's one of the only few people that's ever killed a member of the Phantom Troop has to do with the fact that he has an incredibly broken Nen technique, but more than anything, it has to do with his insane intellect. See, Kurapika is undoubtedly one of the most intelligent people in the Hunter x Hunter universe. While occasionally his decision-making does get clouded by sheer anger and malice towards the Phantom Troop, he was still able to, rather masterfully, pull on the heartstrings of Pakunoda and the rest of the Phantom Troop by using Chrollo as a bargaining chip. Because even though Chrollo believes that truly every single member of the Phantom Troop is replaceable, himself included, Kurapika understood that the Phantom Troop has been together for a long time and therefore would have sentimental attachment to each other. And dealing with the Phantom Troop isn't the only time that Kurapika was able to show his massive intellect. Kurapika, with the faintest of clues, was able to deduce which bodyguard application belonged to which prince for the Black Whale, and therefore Kurapika tried to apply to be Prince Halkenberg, the 9th prince's bodyguard, but it was later revealed that the 8th queen, the mother of the 14th prince, Oito, specifically put out a posting that would attract people trying to apply to Prince Halkenberg, which shows that technically Kurapika's intuition, based off very little evidence, was correct. I mean, Kurapika is so incredibly intelligent, not only was he able to take over the Nostrad family, but he's also been able to convince people that he's a mind reader. And in a sense, he kind of is. And that all ties back into his Nen ability. See, because Kurapika is usually a conjurer. And while conjurers usually tend to be the weakest Nen users, as conjured items are usually never as strong as their real-world counterparts, Kurapika decided to conjure chains that he wears on his hands, and each and every single one of the chains has a different ability. And the abilities are as follows. The chain that Kurapika uses most commonly is his dowsing chain, a chain with a small metal ball on the end of it that can be used for offensive or defensive capabilities, but is more importantly used in deducing if somebody is telling the truth or not. See, because if Kurapika holds his dowsing chain in front of somebody and asks them a question, Kurapika is able to tell by the sway of the chain if somebody is lying to him. On top of that, if Kurapika holds the dowsing chain over a map, he's able to deduce where the person he's looking for is on that map. Thus, the dowsing chain does kind of make Kurapika a mind reader. The next chain that we're going to talk about is Kurapika's middle finger chain, a chain known as Chain Jail, which can only be used against members of the Phantom Troop. Kurapika understood that conjured chains weren't nearly as powerful as regular chains, and even regular chains probably wouldn't be enough to hold most Phantom Troop members, and therefore Kurapika had to make a Nen vow with himself that would claim that he would only ever use Chain Jail against members of the Phantom Troop, and if he tried to use Chain Jail against anybody else, the chain around his heart would explode his heart into smithereens like it did to Pakunoda. And that's because Chain Jail is limited to such a small amount of people, and because the penalty for breaking it is death, Chain Jail is one of the most powerful binding Nen abilities in the entirety of Hunter x Hunter, as not only did it have the tensile strength to bind Uvagin, a man so powerful that his Nen-powered punches were compared to ballistic missiles, but it also forces who's ever wrapped up in these chains into a state of Zetsu, meaning that they can't use Nen. Next chain we're going to talk about is Kurapika's Pinky Chain, which is known as Kurapika's Holy Chain, a chain that he can wrap around wounds to heal using enhancement type Nen. And the healing of the Holy Chain is so incredibly absolute that Kurapika was able to heal something like a fractured arm in a matter of seconds. I'm sorry, the Holy Chain is on his thumb, not his pinky, because what's actually on his pinky is the Judgment Chain, a chain that allows for Kurapika to fire something known as a stake of retribution into the heart of anybody he pleases. And Kurapika, using the chain, is able to bind that person with 2 rules that if they break, the stake will destroy their heart. Now, personally, I don't necessarily know what's stopping Kurapika from being like, don't breathe. That would probably be too powerful and wouldn't fall within the confines of what Kurapika could could set as a rule, but for all intents and purposes, it pretty much operates like Star and Stripes' New Order. Now, Kurapika used this very chain against himself, which is why he's able to limit the usage of Chain Jail to only members of the Phantom Troop. However, because Kurapika is a conjurer by trade, and this is an emission and manipulator technique, Kurapika can only use this technique in combination with Emperor Time, which we'll talk about in a second, but it's basically what makes him a specialist. But last and definitely not least, we need to talk about Kurapika's index finger, because on the index finger, Kurapika has his steel chain, a syringe-shaped needle that Kurapika can fire into people to steal their Nen abilities. And there's literally no requirements or hoops that Kurapika has to jump through to steal somebody's Nen ability. All he has to do is pierce them with a syringe, drain some of their aura, and then bing, bang, boom, I got your Nen technique. On top of that, while Kurapika is draining this Nen from the person, that person is forced into a state of Zetsu, and that person is unable to use their technique until Kurapika gives it back to them. On top of all of this, the death of the original user of the Nen technique does not strip Kurapika of the usage of that Nen technique. However, if Kurapika wants to use the Nen technique, analyze the Nen technique, or loan that Nen technique out, yes, he can do all three of those things, he has to use a different Nen technique known as Stealth Dolphin, and the usage of Stealth Dolphin requires Emperor Time. But what is Emperor Time? Well, it's what makes Kurapika a specialist, and the reason he's in this video today, so let's go over it. When Kurapika shifts his Kurta eyes to Scarlet, he becomes a specialist. This used to be something that would only happen whenever Kurapika's emotions were heightened, but it's now something he can do at will. Now, when Kurapika uses Emperor Time and shifts his eyes to the Scarlet, he's able to use all 6 Nen categories at 100% efficiency. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean 100% power. Kurapika's level of power remains the same in all Nen categories as a conjurer, which means he can still only use emission techniques at 40% of the power that he can use conjuration techniques. However, he can increase the force and accuracy of his emission techniques to that of 100%. And the best way that I really know how to explain it is if Kurapika's usual style is that of a shotgun, and emission techniques, which are the polar opposite of conjuration techniques, are sniping, then Kurapika can't shoot a 50 cal, but he could hit a target a mile away with a 9mm. Would it have the same killing power? No, but Kurapika could add more force to the 9mm bullet to allow it to travel that mile and also still hit the target. However, Emperor Time comes at a cost. Every second that Kurapika spends in Emperor Time shaves an hour off of his life. So if Kurapika uses Emperor Time for 24 seconds, it shaves a whole day off his life. And thus Kurapika tries to mitigate how often he uses Emperor Time as much as possible, because every second he uses it is one less hour he gets to spend with Leorio in old age. Gay, you know they're gay.
Oh, Nick, don't ship canonically non-gay characters with each other.
Why would they look at each other like that then, huh? But even Kurapika, the current MC of Hunter x Hunter, isn't as powerful as our number 3 spot. Because coming in at number 3, we have the strongest of the Royal Guardsmen, Neferpito. Neferpito was by far and away the strongest Chimera ant in existence outside of Meruem, and it's confirmed by basically everything Pito ever did. Pito was able to identify Kite, Gon, and Killua while they were 2 kilometers away from them, and jump towards them so incredibly quickly that Kite barely had time to push Gon out of the way. Pito then managed to rip off one of Kite's arms and kill him in one-on-one combat, even though Kite was one of the strongest hunters currently living. And Pito was able to see Kite, Gon, and Killua from 2 kilometers away, 1, because of their incredible sight, and 2, because their N had the ability to reach over 2 kilometers. Pito was a problem from the second that they were born. Even Illumi, one of the strongest characters in the entirety of Hunter x Hunter, identified Pito as Meruem's top soldier. And this makes sense when you consider the fact that Pito is one of the only people to ever take a full-powered strike from Meruem and live to tell the story. Because when Meruem tried to strike off Pito's head, Pito was simply left bruised, but barely moved. A durability feat so impressive that Meruem himself congratulated the Royal Guardsmen for their strength. And that strength was no joke. Netero, the strongest hunter of all time, so far as we know, pondered to himself when he came into contact with Pito's aura if Pito was stronger than him. Colt, who had witnessed both Netero and Pito's auras, said that Pito was most likely more powerful. And now we, as sense-driven individuals, know that Pito was not stronger than Netero. Netero was able to strike Pito faster than Pito was able to react to and send Pito flying for literal miles. However, still, Pito was able to take a strike from the 100 type Guanyin Bodhisattva with basically no injuries, a durability feat comparable to that of Meruem. And honestly, that might be Pito's strongest aspect, their durability, as not only was Pito able to survive a strike from both Meruem and Netero, but it took multiple full-powered Jaja Kens from Adult Gon to kill Pito. And Pito wondered, after seeing the powers of Adult Gon, if Adult Gon would be able to kill Meruem. Yet still, with post-mortem Nen, Pito was able to, with Terpsichore, rip off one of Adult Gon's arms, a feat that probably nobody outside of Meruem would have been able to accomplish. And yet, crazily enough, the Nen techniques of Pito weren't necessarily what made Pito so powerful, but they definitely helped. See, Pito was confirmed to be a specialist by the water divination technique, as when Pito poured their aura into the water cup with a leaf on top, the leaf crumbled away. Yet we don't necessarily have confirmation as to what Nen specialties any of Pito's Nen techniques fell into. See, Pito is known most widely for kind of three Nen techniques: Dr. Blythe, some puppeteering, and Terpsichora. Dr. Blythe appears to be a manipulation or possibly a conjuration and enhancement technique, as the entire purpose of Dr. Blythe is to summon a gigantic, super creepy doctor with a bunch of tools that's able to do surgery on injured people. And Dr. Blythe is pretty much the best doctor you could ever ask for. It's able to reattach limbs, heal fatal wounds, kind of bring the dead back to life to be puppeteered, and so much more. But yes, Pito also has a manipulation technique called puppeteering that allows for Pito to attach a clown puppeteer to somebody's either living or dead body. That allows for that person to be puppeted either by the puppeteer or Pito directly, and that person is completely controlled in both their movements, their speech, and their Nen techniques by that puppeteer. And even those who weren't Nen users prior to being puppeted can use Nen techniques after being puppeted. But probably the strongest ability that Pito is known for is Terpsichora, which is kind of like Pito using puppeteering on themselves. Pito manifests a gigantic ballerina that attaches strings to Pito's body through its fingertips. And this technique, kind of like Shalnark's override technique, allows for Pito to overcome their own physical limitations, as Pito's able to command Terpsichora to dance past its limits, which cause Pito's muscles to swell and get stronger. And therefore it seems as though Terpsichora is an enhancement or a manipulation technique, but it could also be an emitter technique or just a specialist ability. We can't really say, kind of like we can't really say with any of Pito's abilities, but we know that Pito is a specialist and therefore it doesn't necessarily matter, at least for the confines of today's video. However, with all that said about Pito's power, I do genuinely believe that Pito is weaker than our number 2 spot. Kind of, maybe, I don't know. I don't feel super confident about it, because coming up in our number 2 spot, we have Crollo.
Oh, Nick, what do you mean? Crollo isn't the strongest specialist in all of Hunter x Hunter?
No, he's not. I know that confidently. What I don't know confidently is who would win in a fight between Pito and Crollo. It would be very close. Like, legitimately coin flip close. But do I really need to introduce a person that we all know so well? Listen, if kurapika has one of the best list of feats in Hunter x Hunter, Crollo's probably got the best list. See, while Crollo hasn't been involved in that many fights, every fight that Crollo has ever been involved in has been wildly impressive for him. The first real battle that we ever see Crollo take part in is when he battles against Zeno and Silva Zoldyck simultaneously. Now, mind you, that's the two strongest members of the legendary assassin family, the Zoldycks, who were, at that time, both most likely in the top 5 to top 7 range of strongest characters in the universe. And yet Crollo was able to fight them so evenly that Zeno Zoldyck, the father of Silva Zoldyck, told Silva Zoldyck that he needed to kill Zeno Zoldyck to make sure that Crollo would stay down. And thus we could technically argue that the Zoldycks would have came out victorious in this battle against Crollo. Crollo's sheer intellect and the fact that he sent Illumi to kill the 10 Dons, the people who had put the hit on Crollo in the first place, made sure that the battle between Crollo and the Zoldycks didn't have to reach that point in the first place. Tie us into the fact that Silva had fought against Crollo in the past, and Crollo had survived that encounter. That Zeno Zoldyck, a man who kills somebody every single day to stay sharp, identified the fact that if Crollo fought against him trying to steal his ability, that Zeno would win, but if Crollo fought against Zeno strictly trying to kill him, that Zeno didn't know if he would be able to come out victorious. Speaks to the fact that even in York New City, Crollo was a problem. And yet Crollo has gotten much stronger since that moment, as by far and away the most impressive feat that we ever see from Crollo was his victory in Heaven's Arena against Hisoka. A fight where Crollo had to pull out objectively every stop that he could, but a fight that did ultimately lead to Hisoka's temporary death. While some people would say that Crollo's biggest weakness is his lack of physical strength, as Crollo came in 7th in the Phantom Troop arm wrestling match, it's important to note that specialist and enhancement techniques are the opposite of each other on the Nen chart, and therefore technically specialist should be the weakest at using enhancement-based techniques. So the fact that he even got 7th is kind of impressive. But really when it comes down to it, outside of his master strategic mind, what makes Crollo so incredibly powerful is his Nen technique. Skill Hunter, technique that allows for him, like 2 other people on this list, to steal other people's Nen techniques. However, ironically, while Skill Hunter seems to be the most effective version of the ability to steal other people's Nen techniques, it does have the strictest rules. See, there are 5 restrictions that Crollo needs to surpass before he can steal somebody's Nen technique. He needs to see the Nen technique happen in person. He needs to ask the person about their Nen technique and have that question be answered. He needs the owner of the Nen technique's palm to touch the cover of his Bandit Secrets book. All three of those actions must be completed in 1 hour, and it's become somewhat apparent on the Black Whale that if Krollo's trying to steal an incredibly rare Nen technique, that he needs to steal something akin to a national treasure before trying to steal that Nen technique. But once Krollo steals that Nen technique, it's his until the original user of the Nen technique dies. The Nen technique takes a place on one of the pages of Bandit's Secret, after which at any point Krollo wants to use the technique, he simply has to flip to that page, keep the book open, and use the technique, which for a long time limited Krollo to the usage of just one Nen technique. However, eventually he gets a Nen bookmark that allows for him to use 2 of these stolen Nen techniques simultaneously. Or he can just keep the Nen bookmark in Bandit's Secret and fight with 2 hands. Now, Krollo has stolen an insane amount of Nen techniques with Skill Hunter. Things like Endorphish, the Sun and Moon Seals, Order Stamp, Convert Hands, and most recently, Love Dial 6700, which allows for Krollo to conjure a cell phone, input the characteristics of Nen users he's looking for, and make a phone call. And if there's a Nen user that fits the characteristics of what he's looking for near him, the phone will tell him how to get to that person, which works really well with Skill Hunter because it allows for Krollo to find people whose techniques he wants to steal more easily. And while I could go over every single one of the Nen techniques that Krollo has ever stolen or ever used, really the most important thing to know here is that Krollo was able to identify potentially useful Nen techniques. He then steals those Nen techniques for himself and uses them in tandem with each other with his massive intellect to be basically impossible to beat in combat. And while that looks like gallery faking corpses and controlling them and exploding those corpses on Hisoka in a Heaven's Arena battle, or using gigantic Nen fish that can only exist inside to slowly but surely bite away his opponents, keeping them alive until the Nen fish are dissipated. When it boils down to it, a brain like Krollo's having access to an unlimited amount of Nen abilities so long as he steals enough of them is a terrifying thought. But not as terrifying as a little girl who's able to make quite literally anything possible, because coming up at number 1 on this list, we have Auluka. Yeah, Auluka's a specialist, and technically adding Auluka onto this list is kind of disingenuous, because Auluka herself has no Nen or no Nen abilities. She simply acts as a conduit for Nanika's powers. And Nanika's probably just Ai from the Dark Continent, and therefore Auluka's probably not the one conjuring all this strength. It's probably an entity from the Dark Continent that came back with Maha Zoldyck. I'm sorry, Zig Zoldyck, Maha's grandfather. But that doesn't matter because Auluka can still act as a conduit for Nanika, and since when did allowing somebody else to take over your body not count as your strength? And whenever Auluka does allow for Nanika to take over her body, she can literally do anything. We do not know the upper bounds of what Nanika is able to accomplish. Yes, we know that Nanika's not good at healing people, and therefore Nanika had to come into contact with Gon to heal him, and Nanika wasn't able to give Gon his Nen back because Gon had made a vow with himself to use all the power he would ever have in his entire lifetime. But we don't know if Nanika were to go to Gon and say give him his Nen back, if Gon would get his Nen back. Nanika was simply focused on making sure that Gon survived. But so far as we know, that's literally the only limitation that Nanika is beholden to, which means if Nanika, or more likely Killua, simply wanted every single member of the Phantom Troop gone, he could just wish for that, and they would be. Which is probably why we haven't heard from Nanika or Killua since the ending of the Chimera Ant arc, because my god, are they just a plot device. But yeah, considering the fact that there's a little girl out there who has the ability to wish for whatever she wants or whatever her brother wants, pretty much means that she's always gonna be the strongest person in the universe. So any list that she can be a part of, she's gonna be number 1. But I'm curious to hear from you guys. If you had to make a list of the strongest specialists in Hunter x Hunter, who would be where and why? And genuine question, who do you think would win in a battle between Pito and Krollo? Because I still don't know. Tell me in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. I'm going to run up a Chinese mountain, which they're just like American mountains, but you know, there's Chinese people on them.